Jeffery, Book 3.2, Conductivity. Intro. Electrical conductors, such as copper and silver wire, allow electricity to flow by having free electrons push past each other through a current. It's not so different from how water flows through the current of a river. If water flow encounters large rocks or fallen logs, it will face resistance, which will change the pace of the current. In an electrical circuit, this same type of resistance occurs when electrons collide with large atoms. In the circuit of a light bulb, for example, the central part is the filament. The electrons that pass through the filament encounter a lot more of these atomic collisions, since the filament is made of a less conductive, more resistant material. The kinetic force of these collisions creates heat, and with enough of this activity, you generate both heat and light. My hope and intention here is to demonstrate that the physics of electrical circuits, in terms of the flow of current, conductivity, and resistance, applies just as well to the circuit of a light bulb as to that of our mind and body. Moreover, understanding these sciences, on even a basic level, will demonstrate how thermodynamic and electrochemical mechanisms within us underpin the most crucial principles. Those are regarding what's best for both our mental well-being and our relationship with our environment. Entropy. Conduction is essentially a constraint on the flow of energy, be it heat or electricity. With electricity, excess electrons flow in the direction from negative to positive. And with heat, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that heat always flows spontaneously from a hot to a cold body. Because of these rules, energy is only useful when concentrated. If energy is evenly spread out, neither electrons nor heat is directed in any particular flow, just pure and simple disorder. This even spread of energy is what is called equilibrium in thermodynamics, also known as maximum entropy. Entropy in general is the measure of how evenly spread or scattered energy is. Conductivity could be said to be the exact opposite, as it dictates concentration, direction, and flow. However, according to the second law we just mentioned, every element is subject to entropy eventually, regardless of how conductive it is. If heat is constantly transferred from a hotter body to a colder body, this will continue until there is no hotter or colder body, and equilibrium. Everything is eventually even in temperature, and thus useless, dead. Without concentration or imbalance, there is no power. What we call power is essentially a concentration of energy distribution, wherein the laws of entropy dictate the exertion of that hotter concentration over its cooler, less concentrated surroundings. Without imbalance, there is no discernible activity, as no force has any power over another equal force. If two people push each other at exactly the same level of force, everything stands still, and absolutely nothing happens. That's one way of visualizing equilibrium. Even the universe itself is bound by these laws, and approaching maximal entropy, this inevitable regression towards a standstill, and what physicists call heat death. Thankfully, this won't happen for some 10 to the power of 1,000 years. That's more than enough time for another couple of summer barbecues. However, for our minds and bodies, entropy will come much, much sooner. Human anatomy runs on both heat and electricity too, and is no doubt subject to the same laws of thermodynamics. Right now, your heart is at a different temperature from your brain, and your lungs a different temperature from your kidneys. The moment you die, these temperature differentials will decrease drastically as entropy takes its due and evens out the energy distribution in your being, leaving you both dead and thermodynamically powerless. We, as inhabitants of this universe subject to these laws, are bound by entropy, but we thrive for years and decades without losing all our heat and becoming one temperature, cold and dead. It does happen eventually, but what holds it back? If entropy spells out the death of all things, what then is life? And what keeps it flourishing against the tide of the laws of thermodynamic equilibrium? Well, entropy is increasing all the time and all around, even in life itself. It's as true as the stars in the night sky and the sun rising in the morning. However, There are elements in the world that don't succumb to entropy as rapidly as others. Is the sun beams its rays of heat and light in every direction, spreading its heat quite evenly, almost as an open declaration of entropy itself. A number of different elements make use of this indiscriminately scattered energy and conduct it for their own use. Plants use sunlight for photosynthesis, and animals use sunlight to replenish the heat that's continuously flowing and being lost to their colder surroundings. That's heat from a hotter body to a colder body, the second law. The second law is applied both from the hotter body of ourselves to our colder surroundings, as well as from the hotter body of the sun to ourselves. It's up to anyone's imagination to name the almost infinite applications of this dynamic. However, it is quite ironic to note that we use the increasing entropy of the sun to decrease or delay our own. Since energy is useless when scattered evenly, it is the energy difference between us and the sun that we aren't at equilibrium with it, at least not yet, which makes it useful. However, more importantly, it's conductive elements which concentrate, store, and repurpose this energy for utility, which actually slows and reduces entropy. If you wanted to iron a shirt and heated up some wood instead of, say, a piece of iron for the job, even if we discount the fire hazard and got a smooth wood surface to the same temperature we'd use an iron at, it would still do a worse job. The simple reason is that wood is less conductive than iron. More conductive materials both absorb and transfer energy better than the less conductive ones. So a piece of wood at the same temperature would transfer its heat to the shirt at a slower rate and thus not be as useful. Life is fundamentally grounded on absorbing energy from fuel sources and transferring or conducting that energy towards utility. To be alive is to be conductive, and the energy differentials maintained by organisms are what conceives the harmony of organic processes as energy flows from warmer to cooler regions and temperature is regulated by selective concentrated energy output. So if life and death lie at each end of the spectrum of conductivity and entropy or constructivity and destructivity, what I'd like to propose is that to be more alive is to be more conductive. To be more conductive is to be more constructive. To oppose entropy at all fronts is to live life to its maximum potential. So becoming more conductive is the goal, though accomplishing that has its own worries and obstacles. Resistance is folly. As tempted as I was to make use of the quote, resistance is futile, that wouldn't be entirely accurate. Resistance in electronics is defined as the measure of pushback electronics face when flowing through a circuit. Being more conductive is to simply minimize resistance and thus entropy, but not eliminate it. So, resistance at suboptimal levels is folly. But what does that mean in the real world? Perhaps Barry incandescent and Bobby fluorescent will help shed some light on the matter. Barry incandescent, Bi, and Bobby fluorescent, Bf, both sell light bulbs that brighten your room at equal levels. The only difference is that Bi's light bulbs require 5 times more electricity for the same effect. That's 5 times the resistance for the same outcome. Of course, this is the classic incandescent versus fluorescent light bulb comparison. Fluorescent light bulbs happen to be 4-6 times more efficient than incandescent, and LED bulbs even more so. Given that incandescent light bulbs give off most of their energy as excess heat instead of the desired outcome of visible light, the question I ask is, how much does the same apply to our actions and intended outcomes? How much of our efforts and energy is wasted on excess resistance heat with respect to our desired outcomes? The cost of waste. Now, the term electrical conductor is the label we give to materials with the least amount of resistance. This means electrons can flow through continuously without the amount of atomic collisions that would generate excessive heat, thus either breaking down, burning, or melting the material. So, while resistance is inevitable, conductors resist at the most optimal levels and yield to entropy minimally. In electrical circuits, resistance inhibits the flow of current. This reduction of current has two significant effects, one positive and the other negative. Positive, reduced current can prevent overload and thus damage to other components in the circuit. Negative, reduced current can also underload components that need it. Now, for practicality, it's better to interpret resistance as effort. Our body runs on electrochemical circuitry, and every case of effort or exertion requires the exact mechanism of resistance that exists in an electrical circuit. Of course, it doesn't fully outline the intricate complexities of biological organisms. However, what I'm trying to point out here is that on a baseline level, the rules are the same. Every case of resistance without utility is, by default, waste. The filament in your classic incandescent light bulb, however, does actually generate a lot of heat and does eventually break down. Tungsten, which the filament is made of, is more resistant than the copper wires in a light bulb circuit, but still conducts electric current. The higher rate of atomic collisions in more resistant materials means that more energy is scattered and dispersed. In other words, more resistance equates to more entropy. And as you know, more conductivity equates to less entropy. So, you may be wondering how on earth this has relevance to us being more conductive as humans. Well, jumping back to water flow and light bulbs, in physics, they teach you that the incandescent light bulb conducts less than 5% of its heat energy into visible light. Over 95% of this energy output is just excess heat to us, more resistance than conductivity. And of course, this excess heat radiates indiscriminately in every direction, meaning, similar to the sun, entropy is high. High resistance with proportionally low utility. Resistance without utility is, by default, waste. That's why we've switched from incandescent light bulbs to fluorescent lights. That gets us 60 lumens per watt of energy, compared to just 16 lumens per watt from incandescent light bulbs. That's several times more efficient, at the very least. Also, less waste, as well as lower entropy, since more energy is harnessed than scattered. So, in real-life terms, looking at a coping mechanism, such as anger, it raises heart rate and bodily temperature to streamline your motives and actions into a favorable path. However, just like the incandescent light bulb, much of the energy released in anger amounts to an escalated heart rate and body temperature increase, as well as kinetic muscle tension. Much of this excess resistance amounts to scattered energy, affecting things and people around indiscriminately, rather than being harnessed to conduct your current affairs. In electronics, what we describe as a conductive element is one that harnesses energy flow with the least resistance. The same applies to a conductive mind. The best solution you can conjure is the one that gets the job you want done with the least amount of energy wasted. Anger and rage, as we just discussed, can affect and unravel far more than you intend to. So even if it gets the job done, there's generally a calmer, more efficient method. So I'm sure by now you're asking, what's so wrong with letting off a little steam or wasting a bit of energy if it makes us feel better? I suppose it's inevitable from time to time. We can't always maintain a conductive mind. Though if avoidable, we also don't want to be spending more time or energy than we need to either. Conduct your mind. A non-conductive mind is evidenced in its wastefulness. Harnessing more energy than is containable results in increased entropy, and thus more chaotic outcomes. Excess energy spent yelling, for example, affects more than just a current objective. It affects everyone around who hears and may or may not have anything to do with the ordeal. The energy output is indiscriminate, high resistance, and thus non-conductive. If you look at how a watermill makes use of a stream, the water wheel does slightly hinder the flow of current, but only to conduct the kinetic energy in another form and direction. It doesn't block the stream. If it did, that excess resistance would cause unnecessary flooding and disorder. You can compare this to a conductive mind, where the energy potential in your mind and body conducts and outputs energy flow in an orderly manner. Every step we take, and every thought we invest in, will do best following the pattern of a watermill, harnessing energy in harmony with the flow rather than against it. causing tension and blockage. Healthy coping mechanisms and realistic expectations are essential for this harmony. So, when I speak of conductivity in human terms, it's to signify energy-efficient response from the mind and body. Resistance, of course, is the opposite, an exorbitant energy response. Born to resist. We're born into this world in a bewildered, confused, and unable to predict or contain the reality around us. Our initial response to this conflict, of course, is crying and screaming in a fit of woe or rage. The body's energy is dispersed into kinetic muscle tension, increased heart rate and body temperature, as well as the acoustic energy dispersed from our lungs through noises we make. The disorderly response is inevitably down to our inability to harness and conduct the energy of our environment as our own, and so we resist. Since infant cognition is at the beginning of its development, energy output, of course, isn't well controlled. It's simple, instinctive, and driven by somatic impulses. Food, warmth, and alleviation from physical discomfort are all we know at that age. With little to no control over our responses and energy output, our energy output can far exceed what's necessary. As we grow, learn, and become more familiar with our environment, we start to build little watermills in our mind, cognitive coping mechanisms that produce results we want at less resistance. We protest less, cry less, and our cognition becomes more conducive. This path towards conductivity is not necessarily a linear progression, however. Not everyone's coping mechanisms evolve much further from infancy. Also, the coping mechanisms that work in one environment may not work in another. Our ability to work in harmony with our environment depends on how familiar we are with it, bearing in mind that cognition is dependent on memory. If our environment changes, so does our ability to conduct its energy. We aren't robots with preset responses and with a static perimeter of responses at all times. A conductive mind is built by refining responses to frequent encounters, so we're more likely to lose control of our energy output in new or unfamiliar territory. In a situation where we don't know what actions are necessary, we naturally perform unnecessary actions and end up spending more energy than we need, which amounts to less conductivity and more resistance. What we're resisting and why. In an electrical circuit, resistance restricts the flow of electrons, electrical energy, by dispersing it into a different type of energy. The more light bulbs are put on a simple circuit, the less bright they glow. They each convert a certain amount of the available electrons into heat, and thus the overall flow, the current, is decreased proportionally. The end result is that each light bulb will receive less energy for each one added, and thus have less to discharge. When a baby cries, the same mechanism is in place. The pain signals they receive from hunger or discomfort light up and glow in the circuits of the brain and body. The more they exert themselves physically and convert their own available electrochemical energy into different kinds of energy, the less energy their pain signals receive. So those pain signals glow less brightly, proportionally to how many different competing energy outputs there are, not at all different from a simple electric circuit. So overall, what we're resisting is pain. And pain is just a failure to conduct energy input from our senses in harmony with our overall health and expectations, basically disruptive signals. Resistance serves the purpose of counterbalancing disruption and regaining a steady, manageable flow. Think of it like how a boat needs water to float, but if water gets inside and overflows, it will sink. To be conductive is to sail your boat safely without getting flooded, avoiding rough waters, and maintaining a maneuverable speed. Whereas resistance is damage control. It's only necessary once all the water gets in. Conductive, manage control. If your word's conductive, that can be used. So it does serve a purpose, but prevention is better than cure. So while adults cry too, for babies, that's basically all they know. Offset the flooding of their sensory input with sensory output. It's actually pretty clever for a baby if you think about it. But it does have a cost. Such high energy output can't be sustained indefinitely. So there are better, more efficient ways to respond other than straight-out maximum resistance. As we grow and get older, as we do learn these more efficient responses, we learn to respond in a more conductive manner, where we can interpret some previously troublesome signals as instruction rather than disruption. When we don't know how to respond to an impulse, it becomes disruptive, and so we resist. When we convert a disruptive signal into an instructive one, where we know how to respond, we become more conductive. The path of least resistance. Older children and adults, when compared to babies, naturally have a much wider range of coping mechanisms to conduct energy flow and reduce both emotional and physical pain signaling. So, when we learn to play with toys and other people, communicate and share feelings and ideas, we are conducting the energy input of our surroundings as our internal flow. There will be some resistance, of course. Even the best sailor will encounter bad weather, but the idea is to keep it to a minimum. You want to be spending as little time as possible bailing water off the boat. If you want to enjoy the journey, that is life. Unrefined mechanisms that can cause unnecessary disruption can be as simple as grabbing someone's attention, for example. Is shouting necessary to get the attention you need? Would a whisper be enough? In ordinary circumstances, the basic communication skills, even from childhood, inform us of the tone needed to gain attention. It can be misjudged, of course, which would require a repeat effort. And that's where things become a little tricky, because even the simplest miscalculations often result in disappointment. Disappointment brings rise to annoyance, and that annoyance, a frustration that can cause us to protest, uses more energy than necessary to avoid another disappointment. That energy spillover from exertion can then upset and disappoint others, leading to further disappointment, increasing resistance in both yourself and others. So, put simply, a small bit of resistance from a small disappointment can easily escalate into something much larger if we're not careful. And what's our defense against this? Intelligence. Intelligent conduct. Intelligence entails the intuitive knowledge that measures the correct level of energy output necessary for any particular incentive. A coping mechanism is the application of that intelligence. A lack of intelligence is evidenced by miscalculating, or not calculating, the necessary energy required for an outcome, and thus undershooting or overshooting one's goal. This inevitably leads to disappointment, which is, if I can state the obvious, bad. But seriously, it's really bad, perhaps more so than you may think, because it creates the horrible problem of energy leaks. Your brain has a built-in system for monitoring whether your expectations match reality, a small region called the lateral habenula that acts like an internal accountant. When your predictions fail, this disappointment detector doesn't just make you feel bad, it actually cuts your dopamine supply, leaving you with less energy and motivation to achieve your desired outcome than you started with. This is perhaps why disappointment can be so painful and why it gets progressively harder to bounce back from repeated failures. It's hard to say why, but basically, the brain taxes us for miscalculation. So if you were happy to spend 5% of your energy on any particular goal, failure could cost you double, 10% on your next try, or even more. And each time we fail, we're taxed more, and knowing that is what causes us to overshoot our goal in frustration to avoid a repeat disappointment. So the problem of energy leaks, being left with less energy to spend than we used to, can cause us to go from 0 to 100 in resistance, a form of damage control. Energy leaks bring us much closer to infant-level responses. Intelligence as a perpetually refined prediction tool is essential for a stable response. The obvious advantage is preventing the unnecessary loss of energy from disappointment. But interestingly enough, it also includes having the sense to know how to handle energy leaks when they do occur. Since no one will have perfect accuracy in prediction or perfect intelligence, disappointment is inevitable. Acknowledging this allows us to, quite ironically, not be disappointed by disappointment. Babies, of course, have the lowest ability to predict and project on reality and suffer disappointment as a result too. One study pointed out that when a baby sees someone approach and expects it's their mother, the disappointment of seeing someone else often results in a cry of rage rather than sadness. Babies, however, don't really depend on their intelligence as much as adults, since they have their needs taken care of by their caregiver. They can therefore be soothed and calmed down before their energy leaks and resistance cause too much stress on their body and brain. So their energy leaks are basically managed externally by the intelligence of their caregiver. Adults need care, love, and support too. But being more independent means relying more on the knowledge and tools in the brain, cognitive coping mechanisms to fall back on, since we generally don't have a caregiver on full-time duty as adults. There comes a higher dependence on what's totally within our minds. So in light of minimizing resistance, we don't just want to avoid wasting physical energy, but our mental energy, cognitive resources too. Despite being only 2% of the body's mass, the brain accounts for 20% of energy metabolism. And considering that bodily functions such as heart rate, temperature, and the immune system work automatically, it's mostly just our cognitive resources that we can actually manage and economize. If you fall ill, your body will raise its temperature and put up resistance. This is an energy leak you have no control over. As for your mind, energy leaks completely depend on how conductive it is. Conductive cognition. Needless to say, not all cognition will be conductive. We will make bad predictions and hold false expectations, and our lateral habenula will punish us as a result by releasing GABA neurotransmitters into our striatum and stifling dopamine potential. What's more is that we will have to create a new prediction with less dopamine, less energy, and motivation. So that is to say, every false prediction amounts to an energy leak. The very ideas held in your mind serve to either conduct and sustain your energy flow or disrupt it. Therefore, your conductive cognition rate, the rate at which your actions and projections match up with your expectations, will directly determine the balance of dopamine as well as other neurotransmitters in your brain. Your conductive cognition rate essentially determines your overall happiness. A progressive intellect is crucial for conductive cognition. Learning, adapting, and reflecting allow for realistic expectations that minimize disappointment. The most crucial aspect of that intelligence, however, is not what you may think. That is, the intelligence of reserving one's intelligence. Refining our ability to predict and respond to events in the real world keeps us secure and prepared for what is yet to come. Though the mere act of prediction itself, anticipation is a gamble. So there are often times when prediction should be humbly reserved and expectations simply left open. One popularly held belief is that the higher our intelligence, the less happy we are. Now, I'm proposing that intelligence is the absolute gateway to growth, healthy energy flow, and conductivity. So, would I agree that intelligence leads to more happiness or less? My simple answer is that it depends. The primary purpose of intelligence is to make predictions, but every single prediction is a gamble, with the lateral habenula creating energy leaks. Yet you cannot make a single plan or goal in life without making predictions. So intelligence is in tricky territory. We know high intelligence is marked so due to predictive accuracy, but to get there, one has to start out with pretty low accuracy and work upwards. So it may look like a hurdle of pain, gambles, and energy leaks to the top, but that's not necessarily true. The reason a higher intelligence can lead to more pain and unhappiness is actually less straightforward. If we have another look at babies and children, by default, they're less intelligent than adults. They're less independent, less capable. Yet they're said to smile around 200 times a day, while adults barely manage 20 smiles per day on average. But this doesn't necessarily equate to less intelligence, means more happiness. Children have a lot of things going for them over adults. Excluding the obvious, which is that they have more novel and thus more exciting experiences, there's also the fact we mentioned earlier, their dependence on caregivers. Any unrefined coping mechanisms they have can be offset and complemented with affection, emotional support, and support in general. On the intelligence side of things now, children don't have as many memories and knowledge to predict their immediate reality, but fewer ideas to project on reality. Naturally, that will amount to fewer predictions overall. A child's intelligence is thus more humble, left with open expectation. And since every prediction is a gamble, that also means they gamble far less than adults. More knowledge, intelligence, and especially intellect naturally amount to more overall prediction, and thus more chance for disappointment. Therefore, intelligence isn't only our best tool for conductivity, it's also our worst. So, if you ask whether increased intelligence leads to more happiness or more misery, the answer depends on how it's used. Just like any tool, it has its limitations, and used at the wrong time, it can cause more harm than good. Intellect and reason are more so than general intelligence, because reason becomes more specific. The more specific your expectations are, the less margin of failure you leave yourself, and thus the more accurate you need to be. So, conductivity is not necessarily just a matter of mastering your environment to a level where you can anticipate anything. Being open, at peace with it, and knowing when to reserve judgment and prediction is just as important. Why intellect fails us. Now, while an ever-evolving intellect is essential for growth and individual conductivity, which dictates your overall happiness, as discussed before, it can be made almost non-essential for an individual through healthy social ties and good caretakers. In addition, its unique power to greatly enhance one's conductivity can be eclipsed by its capacity to do just the opposite. Inaccurate prediction and heavy investment in learned responses beyond what they're useful for can result in lots of energy leaks and an increase in resistance rather than conductivity. This is why, of the three most essential elements for conductivity, which I'll mention shortly, I don't include intelligence as one of them. After all, children are often much brighter and happier than adults, despite having a lower intellect on average. Less intellect, of course, results in less overall prediction, which we explained as a gamble of the brain's resources. As for what it is that keeps intellect in the harmony of working for our best interests as opposed to against us, there's a big clue in Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Society. The fatal misstep of intellectuals is assuming that superior ability within a particular realm can be generalized to superior wisdom or morality overall. Intellect is a tool and a skill that is refined in certain fields of expertise. However, the level of confidence one attains in one domain doesn't always translate to others, or it could translate well into some other domains and poorly into others. Confidence in areas where one's expertise doesn't translate well is obvious folly, and is quite essentially what arrogance is. Therefore, the most important factor of intellect in terms of maintaining conductive cognition is knowing one's scope of competence, and this requires being humble. The essential three. 1. The humble. While it is very important to be both proactive and assertive in your known domain of expertise, acknowledging the limits of one's competency prevents unnecessary miscalculation, leading once again to disappointment, energy leaks. So humbleness is the fail-safe of intellect, and also one of our essential three. Maintaining open expectations instead of heavily investing in an anticipated result keeps a healthy and flexible outlook. It safeguards against persistent disappointment as your expectations aren't restricted to specific outcomes. Surprises can thus be more pleasant than conflictual, which makes you more conductive than resistant. This isn't simply a solution to one's own discomfort and misery, but the energy leaks you save yourself simply by being humble and open-minded save you from disrupting the spirit of others around you too. Like we said before, Even the smallest disappointment can escalate to disaster, simply because one disappointment can lead to another. With less energy, we're less efficient, and so we can be consumed with the downward spiral of frustration. An outburst of frustration doesn't just hurt you, but everyone in your wake. And you wouldn't guess what that leads to. More disappointment. The solution: a humble outlook on life. A minor caution, however: being humble isn't a virtue by default. If you find yourself in an aeroplane going down because its pilot is incapacitated and you're the only other trained pilot on board, now is the time to be assertive, not humble. That is in line with the principle of being assertive in your domain of expertise, but humble in other fields. 2. The kind. When we spoke of infants having less developed intellect than adults, it was noted that they can still thrive very well, if not even better, due to support from caretakers. Here we arrive at our number 2 essential: kindness. You may wonder why kindness isn't number 1, and the simple reason is that making sure you aren't causing harm and conflict takes priority over mending harm and conflict. Prevention is better than a cure. However, aside from that, kindness is indeed the most important element for conductive cognition, simply because it conceives responsive harmony to both our physical and emotional environment. The energy you give and pass on spreads to others and has a direct effect on your social environment, as well as the physical environment maintained by yourself and others. The reality is that everyone around you has the same hurdles of facing disappointment and failure, and as they face those, they can cause disruption to themselves and others, including you. So, while being humble prevents you from being a disruption for others, being kind prevents others from being a disruption to yourself and others. So, not only are you being more conductive to your environment, but you're also making your environment more conductive in your absence. Therefore, whatever social circuit of energy you become a part of becomes more conductive as a result. Less energy leaks means more energy to go around for all. Ideally, kindness leading to more kindness. 3. The truth. The last of the essentials ties in very well with the first: humbleness. This is quite simply the truth. Being assertive in areas of expertise and humble when in unfamiliar territory is consistent with what's true in ourselves. And deviating from this truth, having confidence in areas of incompetence, has its consequences. However, adhering to truth goes far deeper than simply avoiding disappointment and optimizing intellect. The truth goes right down into the fabric of our being, where humbleness wards off unnecessary blunders and disasters. Being truthful wards off a disastrous existence. Coming back to the gambling notion, we said before that every prediction we make runs the risk of the lateral habemular region of the brain cutting our dopamine supply. This causes the problematic energy leaks. What I didn't mention, however, is that the lateral habemular punishes us proportionally to how truthful we are with ourselves. It may sound a bit odd to say that our brain's neurochemistry is hardwired to punish dishonesty, but it's actually a lot simpler than that. Plans and predictions we make with solid grounding, tried and tested in memory, require little cognitive investment. At a lower cost, there's a lower penalty. Now, when we cement our expectations more so in assumption and imagination, instead, the cognitive investment and energy output required is much higher. At a higher cost, there's a higher penalty, but also a higher reward too. Hence why risks can be an enticing thrill for some, despite the known perils. To make it even simpler, think of gambling with money you have to spare compared to money you don't have. Losing money you can afford is one thing, but debt is a whole other monster. When we form our expectations based on what's true in memory, we use resources the brain already has, and that's perhaps why it's less painful to let go. When we form expectations based on what's created in imagination and theory, we have to spend the brain's reserves to project this new reality, and losing it is pretty costly because, as it turns out, the brain doesn't want to spend these reserves without a return on investment, so it blocks your reward pathways depending on how much you spent. This was all founded in the research on the lateral habula's role in motivation, differentiating between tonic and phasic dopamine release. Tonic dopamine sings to the high risk, high reward factor. And phasic dopamine is the converse to explain a little further. So the brain holds what we imagine and theorize in a very different regard to what we've confirmed as true in memory. Truth could be a difficult word to define. To clarify here, I basically use the word truth to contrast between environmental stimuli, i.e., sensory memory, and mental stimuli, i.e., imagination, output. Of course, memory and imagination can be a jumble at times. So, as a basic rule, the truth is recorded memory minus input from imagination. And of course, if you struggle to tell the difference, your brain's lateral habenula won't. It differentiates very clearly and will frequently punish you for investing in speculation over concrete memory. What's more is that whenever we lie to ourselves through delusion or lie with our tongues, to lie is to resist. That is resistance against sensory input in favor of fabrication rather than conducting and utilizing the flow of sensory input. This connects to a famous thought experiment in physics, Maxwell's demon, a hypothetical being that could decrease entropy by sorting fast and slow molecules, but only by expending cognitive energy to track and process information. The demon's mental work ultimately increases total entropy more than the sorting decreases it. Similarly, when we lie, we become our own Maxwell's demon, expending cognitive energy to maintain separate, incompatible versions of reality. Lying with words has another unintended consequence. Aside from having to invent information and fall into another expectation gamble on it solving your problems, there's also the concept of white lies. People believe it's out of kindness. However, when you tell white lies, or any lies for that matter, you desynchronize your internal reality with the person you may be trying to connect with. Once your brain knows for certain you both are seeing and feeling two different realities, the ability to empathize and mirror the other person decreases enormously. Now, this desynchronization can happen naturally through disagreement or conflict, but in this case, you're the one creating it. And like Maxwell's demon, the cognitive work required to maintain these separate realities creates a net increase in entropy. This brings us to our conclusion. Cognitive entropy. Our brains are remarkably efficient machines, constantly developing shortcuts to save energy. When you get into a taxi, you don't interrogate the driver about their intentions. You trust the system based on countless positive experiences. This kind of mental efficiency is conductivity at its finest. Minimal energy expenditure for maximum utility. But here's where things get interesting. Beliefs are mental shortcuts, but not all mental shortcuts are created equal. The two pathways. Truth-based beliefs flow like electricity through a good conductor. They're grounded in real sensory experience, things you've seen, heard, and lived through repeatedly. Your brain stores these in long-term memory, where they require virtually no energy to maintain. Trusting taxi drivers works because you have actual data, thousands of successful rides, social systems that work, and visible consequences for bad actors. Fantasy-based beliefs, however, work more like a resistor in an electrical circuit. Since they're created through imagination rather than experience, your brain has to constantly spend energy keeping them alive in working memory, that tiny 1% of your mental capacity. Like the filament in an old light bulb, they burn hot and burn out fast. Therefore, when we build our expectations and decisions on fantasies rather than facts, we create what we might call cognitive entropy, maximum energy scattered with minimal useful output. The lateral habenula, that punishment center in your brain, taxes you heavily when reality doesn't match your imagined expectations. And the further your beliefs drift from actual experience, the more energy you burn trying to maintain them. This is why anxiety and fear often feel so exhausting. They're symptoms of cognitive resistance, your mind working overtime to sustain beliefs and worries that have no foundation in your actual sensory experience. So, back to the primary subject. Remember, entropy is the measure of energy scattered and wasted. Conductivity is energy concentrated and flowing efficiently toward useful outcomes. This principle doesn't just apply to electrical circuits or our physical actions, it governs our mental lives too. The most conductive minds are those that stay grounded in truth, remain humble about what they don't know, and treat others with kindness. So, not because these are arbitrary moral rules, but because they represent the most energy-efficient ways to navigate reality. When you base your beliefs on what you've actually experienced rather than what you've imagined, when you stay humble in unfamiliar territory rather than pretending expertise, when you cooperate rather than conflict with others, you're not just being good, you're being thermodynamically efficient. Ultimately, anything that wastes energy resisting reality, increasing entropy for humanity as a collective, is by definition less moral. Anything that efficiently conducts energy toward genuine human flourishing decreases entropy for collective humanity and is more moral. Now, you may initially retort that because anything that increases entropy for humanity is immoral, activities like aerobics or running, which distribute heat more evenly around your body and increase metabolic chaos, would be immoral in this framework. However, this misses the crucial distinction between short-term and long-term entropy effects. While your body does become temporarily more disordered during exercise, the net result is a more efficient cardiovascular system, stronger muscles, and better overall organization of your biological processes. The temporary increase in entropy during the workout creates a body that operates at lower entropy during 95% of your time when you're at rest. Similarly, sexual activity might seem like pure energy expenditure and disorder, but it serves the ultimate entropy-decreasing function, which is creating new life. And life itself, with its incredible organization, consciousness, and ability to conduct energy, represents the most dramatic decrease in entropy possible in our universe. So it's mistaken to assume this is all about avoiding all energy expenditure, but about ensuring that any temporary increases in entropy serve the greater goal of long-term order and human flourishing. It's not about complex calculations or philosophical debates. It's about recognizing that the universe has already given us an objective standard, and our well-being depends on aligning with it rather than resisting it. Truth isn't just morally right, it's literally more efficient. And in a universe governed by entropy, efficiency isn't just practical, it's sacred.